15th lecture in our series of lectures to commemorate the events that took place in and around this building at this time in 1922. And I'll start tonight by introducing the Chief Justice.
Thank you very much, Angela. Good evening, and you're all very welcome to tonight, which is our fifth lecture in our Four Courts 100 lecture series. And I'm really pleased to introduce two speakers tonight. Our first speaker is no stranger to the courtroom, and I'm delighted to welcome her today as a speaker. Ruth has been a practicing barrister in these courts since 1999, specialising in the area of conveyancing, property and landlord and tenant law. She's always, however, been intrigued by the fascinating history of the Four Courts where she works, and her collection of old newspaper stories and historical images of the courts are available to view on her really beautiful blog, the Stories of the Courts, www.storiesofthecourts.com. She also shares these stories on Twitter and LinkedIn. And the title of Ruth's lecture tonight is Women in the Four Courts 1922, and it considers the impact of the occupation on the lives of women in a number from a number of different perspectives. And the stories uncovered give us a unique insight, not just into the hidden side of the Battle of the Four Courts, but also into the position of women in Ireland at the time of 1922 and subsequently. And I'm also honoured to introduce the second part of this really interesting and exciting double act, and that's Professor Eunan who retired in September 2020 from the Bank of Ireland Chair of Contemporary Irish History and as Director of the Trinity College Research Centre for Contemporary Irish History. And perhaps we can just reflect, in my view, on the really significant role that is played in Irish life by, in particular, the chairs of modern Irish history, contemporary Irish history in the universities in Ireland. And Eunan was previously Professor of Government in Dublin City University. He was educated at UCD in Cambridge, where he researched the interwar British Treasury. And he's written widely on aspects of 20th century Irish and British history and politics. And he is in part responsible for some part of the idea behind these events in this lecture series, because back in 2014 he invited me to take part in an early part of a Decade of Centenaries event, which was a commemoration, a really fascinating day-long study, debate, papers on the Curragh Mutiny. And he said there was a really exciting thing happening, the Decade of Centenaries. There were all these events that happened, culminating, and he said, you're involved as well. And then, while Eunan is a very accessible writer, sometimes these historians use technical and difficult terms that you need a glossary for. He said something about culminating with the Big Bang in your place in 1922. So Eunan's lecture is entitled An All-Ireland War, Ireland 1922 to 24, and that in itself has a particular resonance for all of us, because the period between 1922 and 1924 is particularly fascinating for lawyers because of, in a sense, the ambiguity of the position that was at that time, because I'm the 13th Chief Justice, and that means I trace myself back to Hugh Kennedy as being the first Chief Justice of the Free State, but he became first Chief Justice of the Free State in 1924 when the Courts of Justice Act came into force. And so in the period between 1922 and 1924 you had this fascinatingly fluid, ambiguous position where there was a new government, but with a rogue, if you like, as far as they were concerned, court system in the Dáil courts, and the old system in these courts, neither of which they were entirely sure they could trust in circumstances where there was a significant demand for courts to administer law. And that period is fascinating, and it's also interesting for us because it means that in 2024 there will be 100 years of an Irish Supreme Court, and just as significantly 100 years of a new professional district court and a new Irish independent court system. So I'm particularly pleased to introduce both our speakers tonight. I'm going to ask Ruth to speak first. Thank you very much.
Thank At 7:30 p.m. on the evening of 28th of June 1922, a figure dressed in Red Cross nurses' uniform approached Free State forces with a request to enter the forecourts to tend to wounded anti-treatyites inside. The officer to whom the request was made sent the applicant off to the Forecourts Hotel for further interrogation. He was right to suspect something awry. The purported nurse, initially believed to be female, turned out on further examination to be Thomas Barry, signatory of the Irregulars Proclamation and master of Republican guerrilla warfare. No previous denizen of the forecourts would ever have anticipated that a man would one day dress as a woman with a view to securing entry to its premises. But 1922 was an unusual year. Traditionally, the forecourts had been a male-only bastion. The only women about, apart from the occasional litigant or witness, were the housekeeping staff, who spent most of their time quite literally underground, in the basements below the courts they managed. Women had only entered the forecourts as practitioners the previous November. The occupation of the courts by anti-treaty forces in April 1922 put paid to any plans that the first female barristers might have had of standing up to argue their first cases within its walls for the foreseeable future. But as one door closes, another opens, and the occupation of the forecourts resulted in an unprecedented influx of women into its precincts. First came the secretaries to anti-treaty leaders, such as Madge Clifford, personal assistant to Ernie O'Malley. Clifford was in the forecourts, tapping away on her typewriter on the 28th of June, 1922, when one of the first Free State shells hit a building close to where she was working. She subsequently covered over her keyboard and headed for the ovens in the basement of the building to bake bread for anti-treaty soldiers. Clifford's presence in the forecourts made a great impression on the young Todd Andrews, enabling him, in his own words, to realise for the first time that women had roles outside the home. Recalling the role of women in the occupation of the courts, Andrews wrote, "Hitherto, I had regarded women as appendages to men, whose function it was to rear children, provide meals and clothes, keep the house clean, and nurse men when they were sick. It had never occurred to me that they could operate effectively as administrators or political advisors." In the occupation of the forecourts, says Andrews, women of all ages and of different social strata acted as secretaries, nurses, housekeepers, but above all as couriers, maintaining a wonderfully reliable system of communication to the end. Indeed, says Andrews, the system of communications run by women was the only efficient part of the IRA operation during the Civil War. It never failed, thanks to the devotion of these women. Shortly after Clifford was so abruptly disturbed at her work, Geraldine O'Donnell and her nursing team from Eccles Street arrived in the building to assist the wounded. The location of Jerry's Hospital was the western side of the rear block, which is here, you can see it marked on the map, and it's about where the barrister's tea room is today. Many members of Cumann na mBan and women members of the Irish Citizen Army also headed to the forecourts on the 28th of July 1922. Among them was Maura Comerford from Wexford, described by one newspaper as the Joan of Arc of the Republican cause, the daughter of an old county family, just the girl you would expect to find in an English golf course, but at the same time, the girl who defied British soldiers and outwitted auxiliaries. Comerford heard the bombardment at her lodgings in Clonskee, jumped on her bicycle, rushed to the courts, and managed to get in the Chancery Place entrance. So we can see the Chancery Place entrance here, and this is where Maura Comerford would have arrived on the 28th of June 1922. And these are the people who would have been outside the courts looking at what was going on when she arrived there. Maura Comerford's first job was to pick up supplies for Jerry O'Donnell's hospital in Eccles Street and drive them in a van to the forecourts. Comerford had never driven a vehicle before and was unsure how to reverse, something that nearly proved fatal when she was stopped by Free State soldiers on the quays. The van was commandeered, but she was allowed to bring in the supplies it contained, including cigarettes. Later that evening, after fall of dark, Comerford was sent back out to the Four Courts Hotel to negotiate a cessation of fire for the purposes of protecting Jerry O'Donnell's hospital. While she was negotiating, a sympathetic Free State soldier passed her ammunition for the boys inside. The weight of the ammunition nearly caused her skirt pocket to collapse. That night, Comerford slept in a bed of sacks covered by a coat given to her by George Plunkett. The next morning, going out again on a message to Republican forces in O'Connell Street, she found the building full of men, asleep in every place, in every kind of attitude. Madge Clifford was just starting her rounds with a bucket of tea and dry bread. Comerford refused to leave the forecourts when the hospital was vacated. Instead, she crowded with others into the bankruptcy court beside Chancery Place. So this is where they crowded when they knew the last great explosion was going to happen. The hospital had already been evacuated and the explosion took place somewhere around here. I think the best argument which has been made by a recent writer is that it took place in this area here, which of course is exactly where the Law Library is today. And it took place in the basement and it effectively destroyed most of this block at the rear, and then a fire occurred which spread to buildings in the vicinity. And Comerford survived the explosion, but she describes very well the process of waiting for the explosion to happen. Nobody was in any doubt that it was coming. And they were herded into the old bankruptcy court, and Maura Comerford was placed on the circular seating at the back of the court. And as the bombardment intensified, she gripped the back of the circular seating and put her head as low as it could go between her arms, and so stood the others, with backs to the wall, as arranged by their leaders. Clifford managed to survive the explosion, which blew the former hospital to smithereens. And she also managed to escape following the surrender, and she headed straight to her fellow Republicans in the Hamman Hotel. And another Cumann woman in the forecourts at the time of the surrender, Bridie Klein, was arrested, but she was released after a couple of hours. So none of the women in the forecourts in 1922 were actually arrested afterwards. They all managed to avoid arrest. So we often describe the Battle of the Forecourts as a conflict between former male comrades. But in fact, what people often forget is that the treaty divided female comrades too. So in addition to the Cumann na mBan women in the forecourts, you also had Cumann na Saoirse women in the Forecourts Hotel and, Burns pub across the river, ministering to the Free State forces. And certainly the newspapers much preferred the Cumann na Saoirse women to the Cumann na mBan women. There was an article extolling the virtues of the Cumann na Saoirse women in the Irish Independent, which described them as unmarked by badges, unnoticed by the public, unconscious almost of the risks that they ran, the good work which they were performing. They provided so well for those who manned the barricades and fought in the struggle that they won. But of course, you could have said exactly the same for the Cumann na mBan members within the Forecourts precinct, but that was not how the Cumann na mBan members were described. Instead, the newspapers described them as the young hussies or daredevils. It was stated that their sex gave them an unfair immunity that men would not have. It was also argued that they unfairly took advantage of the Red Cross armband to gain entry to the courts. So here you have two Red Cross women after the explosion entering the courts. Were they Cumann na mBan? Were they Cumann na Saoirse? Were they neutral in the conflict? We may never know. But what we do know is that there was certainly a Red Cross van that was ferrying ammunition into the forecourts, because this lady on the left here, who was called Margaret Skinner, brought it over from Glasgow, and it was used very successfully to ferry ammunition and other items to the Republican forces about the city. So maybe there was some truth in that, but certainly the newspaper coverage of the Cumann na mBan women was very negative compared to the coverage of the Cumann na Saoirse women. So you can see that it was all very confusing during the Battle of the Four Courts in 1922. How do you distinguish women from men in nurses' uniforms? How do you distinguish Red Cross members from Cumann na mBan? How do you distinguish Cumann na mBan and Cumann na Saoirse? So there's a lot of confusion about. But the people who must have been most confused during the Battle of the Four Courts in 1922 were those working and living in the courts whose homes and businesses had suddenly become war zones with members of their families rival combatants. So Carberry's column in the Cork Evening Echo reports one poor crying woman as being in O'Connell Bridge on the 28th of June 1922. She had a son in the Four Courts, and her husband was among the Free State forces on the south side of the river, and she was described as gazing down from O'Connell Bridge, heartbroken. And another poor woman told the Liverpool Echo that she had lost her husband in the 1916 rebellion, and now her only son of 18 was in the Four Courts with Rory O'Connor. Mary Kelly, who was a woman shopkeeper in Chancery Street, just at the side of the courts here, or at the back of the courts here, Mary Kelly was 45 years of age, and she died of shock caused by the initial bombardment. And at least one other local woman, Mrs. Gorman of Green Street, was shot to death in the vicinity of the Four Courts during the fighting. And there were a number of other local women from Church Street, Merchant Quay, New Street, Bridge Street and Blackwell Place who were injured and taken to various hospitals. A young married woman, Mrs. Cushion, living with her family above their shop in Chancery Place here, told the Saturday Herald representative that she had remained in her premises all during the fighting. One of the shells fired at the Four Courts accidentally struck the corner of the house and wrecked her shop. She and her husband and family and her sister were having dinner at the time, but they all escaped, fortunately. And next door, her grandmother, Mrs. Mooney, who was aged 90, refused to leave and remained in her house all during the battle. Around the corner in Church Street, a woman living in a dairy shop told the Evening Herald that during the whole fight there was scarcely any damage done to her house, but when the big explosion happened, it blew out all the windows and doors. The compensation claims heard before the Recorder of Dublin in 1923 give a good indication of the financial loss suffered by local women as a result of the battle. And they also stand as testimony to the many female businesswomen in the locality. One woman who worked at the medical mission in Chancery Place lost her entire wardrobe in the conflict. Mrs. Cohen, who is an antique dealer from Ormond Quay, round the corner, claimed £132 for antique glass destroyed at her premises, including what she called a Jacobite wine glass. And the Recorder of Dublin was quite sceptical of her claim. He remarked jokingly that James II must have taken a draught out of the glass. In fact, indeed, he may have, because James II himself camped out on the Four Court site prior to the Battle of the Boyne. Many of the women applying for compensation were drapers and traders in second-hand clothing. Mary Clinch of Thomas Street was awarded £250 for trench coats seized on 3 different occasions during the occupation. Must have been a lot of trench coats taken. Mary Green of Parnell Street gave evidence that 5 men in uniform came to her premises and took away a few articles of female wearing apparel. Perhaps they were the same men who featured in a claim by Miss Bessie Anderton of the high school, Rutland Square, in which she sought compensation for female students' undergarments seized by Republican forces. Their excuse was that these were needed to make bags to hold clay for barricades. The Recorder said he was more inclined to say that the undergarments had been taken to present to female acquaintances. Perhaps some of them ended up in the forecourts to be destroyed in the final bombardment. Such compensation, however, did not cover loss in trade incurred by local businesses during the decade the forecourts was closed following its destruction. As a direct result of its closure, the former court keepers were pensioned off, never to return. When Miss Deverell stood up to argue her first case in 1923, this is Miss Deverell on the right here, she was one of the first two Irish barristers, Irish women barristers, it was in the very different environment of Dublin Castle. Although Miss Deverell herself managed to maintain a successful practice, many of the women who followed her as barristers over the next decade failed to thrive professionally. Would matters have been different had the old law library in the east wing of the forecourts remained open? The women of Cumann na mBan and indeed Cumann na Saoirse likewise failed to flourish in the decades after 1922. Maura Comerford ran a small, unsuccessful poultry farm before becoming editor of the women's page in the Irish press. On leaving the forecourts for the Haman Hotel, Comerford had continued her work as courier, coolly cycling down Sackville Street to the distress of a cinematograph operator who, at extreme personal risk, had been filming the fighting. "That girl," he declared, "has ruined my picture. I've risked my life for nothing, for no one will believe that serious fighting is taking place if a girl cycles through the thick of it." Now, no cinematographer would discard war footage merely because it includes a woman, and the presence of women in the forecourts is an accepted fact rather than a thing to marvel at. But we can all continue to learn from the determination and selflessness of those women who endured the Battle of the Forecourts, as we marvel at the passage of time and the unique and special nature of this reconstructed building on a site filled with layers of history in which we are fortunate enough to be present today. Long may it remain in one piece. Thank you.
Chief Justice, everybody present and anybody watching, I'm delighted to be here. I hope the Chief Justice has brought his gavel to shut me up, because I'm sure I'll mismanage my time. I have, I think, about 25 minutes. Right, well, get ready. Before I begin, can I just mention, I was cycling in and I just thought of Frank Callanan, who was 2 years behind me at school, but was always actually very nice to me and very, in a sense, avuncular, although he was younger. I thought of Frank because he, like me, he's a great cyclist. But unlike me, Frank, you know, I'm now high vis, I have a helmet, I have lights front and back, and it's just, I'm a tediously late middle-aged biker. Whereas Frank, the last time I saw him, I think, was wearing a suit, a coat, one waistcoat or possibly two, and carrying a huge briefcase on the thing. So I'm sure I think he's sorely missed around Dublin, not only within the law, but generally. I just thought I'd say that. I missed his funeral because I was sick. I want to, if this will work. Yeah, oh yeah, it'll work. I want to talk a little bit about a proposition to put to you, which is partly about a book I'm trying to write about, if you like, an island at war, or an all-Ireland war, looking at Ireland from 1922 to 24, thereabouts, not so much in terms of in a sense, Irish political violence without the border. If you study most civil wars of the period, say, of disaggregation of empires after the First World War, they're characterized in particular by the extent of civilian casualties. And not just civilian casualties like the two ladies you mentioned, Ruth, who happened to get hit, but civilian casualties as targets, right? That's the norm in most civil wars. And women are also, very often, and females are part of it. We can see it even today. They are explicit parts very often of civil wars as legitimate victims, legitimate targets, if you like. And that's one of the many ways in which what we call our civil war really doesn't fit that pattern. Notwithstanding that there were sexual assaults on girls and women, notwithstanding that some girls and women got killed, but they were not there to be killed. But if you look at the island of Ireland, In 1922, far more civilians die in Belfast than die in our Civil War. And far more females die in Belfast. I haven't done the counting yet for the rest of Ireland than died in our Civil War. In a sense, the 26 county Civil War, right? So I think we should rethink what we mean. We should, first of all, in a sense, deep partition Irish political violence in these years, because it's all a row about the identity, if you like, of the people of the island of Ireland. And secondly, we have to ask why it was the case that violence was so different in what had become Northern Ireland than it was in this jurisdiction, and fatal violence. I recently published, after many years, a huge study with Dario Curroin called The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which really is a catalogue of deaths from 1916 to December 1921, right? And an analysis as well. And I'm now in the throes of trying to do the same for 1922 to 24, thereabouts. And the thing is, you know, if you're a young girl shot crossing the road in Belfast, right, or if you're a woman as the wife of a special constable killed at Altnavay, they say accidentally, but they killed 5 men, and they say, oh, well, we shot the woman accidentally, which is what you say when you kill a woman in these circumstances. In the Irish sort of separatist tradition, you hardly ever say we kill a woman deliberately, right? But more, so I think there are all sorts of questions we can tease out much more in thinking about this period if we don't, say, unduly partition it, okay? And in that way you can make the island of Ireland as a site of, if you like, of civil war and of ethnic conflict, kind of begins to look more like what we know and are familiar with. If you look at Finland in 1918, 1919, where they have a ferocious civil war, where over 100 women, for example, are executed, right? Not just killed, these are executed mainly by the white side and so on. You get a completely different, I think you look at the the experience on the island of Ireland, and this isn't an argument for Irish unification or against it, but I think it's folly for us simply to think of our civil war as being disconnected from the violence in Northern Ireland and vice versa. Okay, I'm finished now. I'll go on. Now, the other thing, my great friend Mark Seaman, who's the British Cabinet Office's expert on intelligence records, read a book of mine about Kevin Barry. Recently said, all right, Eunan, write a book about the Irish Civil War, but leave your bloody family out of it. Sorry, Mark, he isn't watching, I'm sure. The problem is, my early framing of the Irish Civil War was dominated by my grandmother, Cathy Barry. There she is in her last year of life. You can see, almost regal figure in some ways. She was the eldest sister of Kevin Barry and had become very much involved in separatist activities and so on. She was in the Hammam, which Ruth mentioned. As it fell, she was the last person to talk to Cathal Brugha. She was the link between Dev and Liam Lynch. That's how she met my grandfather, who was Liam Lynch's director of communications, and so on and so on and so on. But the thing is, even in terms of the Civil War, she's a prime example, if you ask me, of somebody who curates memory, family memory, and she decides what's significant, what's not worth mentioning, and what isn't. And arguably, you could say she and her husband in some ways suffered, as the anti-treaty rights always say, they suffered as a consequence of the Civil War, right? But if you look at, there's other ways of looking at suffering and the consequences of Civil War, which aren't only about people who are in a sense part of the elite, but about ordinary people. And again, what Ruth was saying earlier, if you count, for example, the number of Civil War widows in Ireland, all right, we're going to hear about Kathleen Brugha, whose grandsons I was in school with, you know, in a posh blue shirt school in South Dublin. So the Brughas had survived. And I'm not knocking Kathleen Brugha. You're not going to hear about Winifred Hunt, or are you? Winifred Hunt was married to a fowl dealer in Sligo. A fowl dealer is not a very prestigious, you know, it's a marginal kind of existence. She had 10 children where her husband was dragged out and shot dead by Frank Carty's men in Sligo in November 1922. So do you not think her story, how did she manage? 10 children, that's most of you don't have that many children. I have 2, well 3, right? But it's, imagine 10 children and absolutely almost nothing. And her husband wasn't in the National Army, so she wasn't even going to get an exiguous military pension, right? And is her story not as important and as interesting as that even of Maura Comfort, who's a great friend of my grandmother's? Do you see what I mean? And we're now in memory. If, presumably, Winifred Hunt, if she had the time, was just as bitter about the Civil War as, say, Rory O'Connor's sister. You know, Rory O'Connor, who were one of the anti-treaty leaders in the Four Courts, effectively the military leader here, who was captured and in the end, in December 22, was shot completely beyond the law by government order. And Rory O'Connor's sister, she applies belatedly for a military service pension, saying I was dependent on my brother. Now, she owned 4 houses in Dalkey, so she wasn't that badly off. The interesting thing is, if you look at her file, a TD intervenes on her behalf. It's not Lionel Booth, who was Fianna Fáil TD. It wasn't David Anders, who I think had just been elected, and of course, a distinguished barrister. It was a man called Liam Cosgrave, right? So what's going on about Civil War bitterness and so on? How does bitterness that we hear about, do you see the issues that arise there? I mean, I'm rather sceptical. My grandmother would not speak to De Valera ever again after 1926. But she would speak to Dick Mulcahy, bloody Dick Mulcahy, right? Once Mulcahy went into government with her friend Sean McBride. She wouldn't speak to Frank Aiken ever, except if you look at my grandfather's pension papers, Jim Maloney's pension papers. In 1935, she goes in to see the minister, and there's a note on the file saying Mrs. Maloney went to see the minister. He directs that her husband's and her brother's, Mick Barry's, applications be dealt with expeditiously. So she didn't recognise the Free State. She was bitter as we would turn her back, all that stuff, unless she needed something. I'm not saying it of her particularly, but I do say it generally of the proposition that Ireland was so bitterly divided. Oh my God, we got Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. But other countries have different political parties as well. It seems to me our Civil War was far less politically divisive in the sense of fracturing society. And I'm not knocking what happened in Kerry and so on. Than were most other European or other polities faced with what is called Civil War. Anyway, sorry, I never called her Granny. Gags. And there she is with Countess Markovich in 22, going to America. And there she is, a young woman. One of the difficulties with memory where you know people as a kid, I met loads and loads of old Republicans especially, right? And old Republican ladies, if they weren't abed like my grandmother, they nearly always had fur coats and what kind of gloves? Leather gloves and hats, right? So when I think of coming on, right, of people like Leslie Price, Tom Barry's wife who I met at my grandmother's door. See, I think there was little old ladies, you know, dodging bullets and things, not as young girls. And similarly for IRA men, of whom I met loads of old IRA men. They all had coats. Mostly they had hats. Do you remember when men wore hats? Right? And everybody smoked. So when I think of an IRA ambush, I think really of basically these septuagenarians, whatever you call them, they're 80-year-olds behind a hedge. It's very hard to think of them as young people, you know? But anyway, to move on. But just to mention the kind of things that we should look at, I think we should look at the unfamous as well as the famous. This is the death certificate for a girl called Maggie Livingstone, right? She's from Cavan. She's killed on the 18th of June, 1922. Now, is this part of a civil war? Well, if you show this to a Hungarian or to somebody from the Ukraine or somebody looking at even internally in Germany or somebody from Turkey, relating to the period where they were experiencing these internal divisions and border conflicts, they say, of course it is. And they say, Livingstone, oh, she's a girl. Is that a gendered killing? It wasn't, but still. Secondly, she's been shot. Thirdly, she's Protestant in a border area, right? And if I was studying other countries, I'd say, oh, well, that's very interesting. Is that an ethnic thing? Is it a gendered crime or whatever? Whereas this is just Irish, the IRA were just raiding the house for guns. She looked out the window and somebody shot her in the head. There was nothing, in a sense, as we always do, we take it in our own case usually as being nothing personal, as it were. Do you see what I mean? As distinct from the possibility that having raided that post office several times, somebody was so fed up he thought, well, we shoot the daughter and then that'll put manners on them. But does she belong to the Civil War? No, she doesn't if we say the Civil War kicked off, when the referee blew his whistle, at whatever time it was on the 28th of June. But the provisional government forces and the anti-treaty IRA were fighting before that around the country. The IRA had killed quite a lot of people, mainly ex-police and so on, but as we know, in Bandon in April, they killed a clutch of Protestants in West Cork, and so on. So when you start and when you finish, I think it's very complicated. And if we think of the issue of refugees, again, refugees are a big part of civil war, typically of the narrative. Again, I don't even want to mention the Ukraine. This is from Kosovo in 1999, and these are Kosovars essentially fleeing Serbs, right? Full stop. And you get a million photographs like this. But when you look for refugees from the Irish Civil War, if you Google, I Googled refugees Ireland 1922, that I got this picture in Getty Images, right? And it is quite a moving picture. You can see all their bits and pieces, the poor wee girl holding the thing. But when you look closely, these aren't refugees from Dublin. These are refugees in Dublin from where? From Belfast, right? And you do have, now we don't know how long it remained, but you have thousands of nationalists, hundreds of nationalist families flee into this jurisdiction in 1922. So you could argue, do they simply become part of our Civil War? Or, hey, wait a minute, is what's happening in Northern Ireland not really part of the same conflict in some ways? But having said that, and again, how our Civil War differs so much, I'll go back to family stuff, I'm afraid as an example. My grandfather, Jim Maloney, was Director of Communications, or whatever it was called, in Liam Lynch's staff. His brother was Adjutant General and later Deputy Chief of Staff. Con, his brother, who was wounded when they were captured, he's let go in December 1923, right? In theory, number 2 on the anti-treaty side, they let him go. Within 2 months, he's given the job, the prime job, which alas he mismanaged, by the local council of rate collector. Now, you're too young to understand the way rate collectors used to work, but essentially they gathered in the rates, kept the money, like solicitors in the good old days, resting in their account, and then returned it every quarter. So there was terrible things that could happen, and did in some cases. But so he gets a cushy number, despite being, in theory, number 2 on the anti-treaty side, within two months of leaving. Ernie O'Malley, and I made this point to Ernie's son Cormac, who was saying, oh, they all had to emigrate. Ernie O'Malley, Assistant Chief of Staff, very badly wounded, he too was released towards the end of 1923. And for a while, where does he go? He goes back to being a medical student. My grandfather, Jim Maloney, goes back to being, he's just qualified as a pharmacist. He went back to the same business, to his father's business in Tipperary Town. Nobody took the business from them. All right? This is not the usual way we look at to think about civil wars. I'll move on because I'll never finish. Just an example, there's my grandfather on the left, there's Maurice Toomey, Chief of Staff of the IRA from 26 to 35 beside him. There's Jim O'Donovan sitting there who became the Director of Chemicals. He was the last survivor when he died in 1979 of the pre-split IRA executive who was married to my great-aunt Monty Barry. And so these again are the kind of old men that I imagine sitting behind, as I say, behind a hedge or pulling the trigger on a revolver. But I guess the treatyites, Free Staters probably also have memories, do they? I mean, you know what I mean? Is it only, I think memory is very much dominated on the popular culture. I was really pleased to mention coming to Saoirse, Ruth, because everybody talks about coming on. Everybody talks about anti-treaty women as though they were the vanguard who in the future would say, let's have abortion on demand, let's have whatever. We attribute modern values to people we see as the radicals then. But anyway, to move on. House burnings, which is the dimension of the Civil War, where in some sense Ireland, in the Irish independence movement, is meant to hang its head in shame. That's in Inistioge in Kilkenny. It's Woodstock House, I think it's called, right? That's a picture I took a few years ago. It's a beautiful house. It was burnt in July 22 by anti-treatyites. And Terence Dooley's recently published a terrific book on the burning of the big houses in the Civil War. But Dooley's book emphasises how varied were the motivations in the different burnings that took place, as distinct from it simply being a crusade against the Anglo-Irish, and by implication a kind of sectarian crusade, as it has sometimes been. But also it is often presented, certainly in a British context, as somehow the burning of big houses as reflecting an innate Irish barbarism. You know, these beautiful houses with their fine Italian, like this, fine Italian plasterwork and the pictures on the wall and the antelopes' heads and the assegais, and how those Irish vandal peasants, ignorant barbarians. But of course, most of the libraries in Ireland, in Munster, in 1920 and 21, they were burnt down by who? By the British, right? The idea that and the other point, I have a grievance about this. Who burnt down those houses? Who in 1922? Do we know how many? Well, we know how many in Belfast, hundreds. We don't know how many between 1920 and 1923 across the whole of Ireland, including, I would say this, that's my grandfather's house in November 1920. Now, there probably wasn't an assegai, or a rhinoceros horn to be seen, right? Or a pith helmet, or a picture of, Queen Victoria, but it was still their home. My great-grandmother had 8 children, of whom one had been killed already. One was in the Royal Air Force, and then another was killed in 1921, and so on. But that was her house, that was her home, that was her memories, that was, everything that she possessed was gone. And so I would argue those houses, and that was kind of middle class, the pharmacy, the houses of everybody that are destroyed, need to be itemized and reflected on and so on, rather than focusing simply on some fine manorial buildings as we tend to do. I just tend to move on again. This is a bit funny. I'm trying to make a point here, Chief Justice, and I'll never get there. This is partly my argument about what kind of people suffer and what kind of people didn't in this conflict. This is a picture I found recently. It is inevitably of relatives of mine. It's my grandmother, Annie Rice, who was then 17 when she got married, and Hughie Hapner, her husband, who was a senior figure. He was vice OC of the Belfast Brigade, technically at least, and he ran East Down for a while. But they had to leave the day they got married in June 22. They had to leave the north because what was going to happen? Otherwise, he was going to get interned for indefinitely, okay? And my grandmother, that grandmother, arguably, she had 13 children in 18 years. In 5 or 6 different places in Ireland, because my grandfather became a Garda sergeant. Ola Duffy gave him a job as a Garda sergeant, right? And if you think, she had probably never been to a town bigger than Newry, okay? And she had to have this family, a bit like Winifred Hunt, but much luckier, because her husband didn't die until she was 38. And she must have spent most of her time being pregnant and/or nursing a baby, because there was no money, no formula, all around. But she was moved away, because in those days, and she was a farm girl. You had your cousins, you had your unmarried sisters, you had a support network. She had none of that, and she would be no sooner settled somewhere than her husband was posted elsewhere. And again, she's in some ways an ordinary woman who, you could say she did extraordinary things, but she's not, people like her, she's a northerner who had to move south, is what I'm saying. Or her husband had to move south. And that's a narrative, again, which is kind of, I'm not saying it in contrast to, but there are arguments, obviously, about the Protestant population in Ireland, and there's very powerful narratives, some of them not publicly stated within Protestant communities about people, especially in border areas, moving north or having to move north, whether they lost the land or not, because they feel unsafe or because they're threatened. But there is also, for Northern Republicans especially, it worked the other way. An example, there's Alice Mallon, who was, at the age of 19 was described by B Specials as the mainspring of what's the phrase here? She's absolutely, the dangerous type of girl was the brains of the IRA in Cookstown, right? Which is something to be said for her. But she leaves the North in order to avoid being arrested. But then she comes back. She comes back, why? Because her elderly father needs minding. And the thing is, the difficult thing for Alice Mallon was, for a young woman of her time, she had become a typist, right? So she could work independently. Do you know what I mean? She didn't have to just stay at home and do the chickens and do the potatoes and all that kind of thing. And she was what they do in the end. They lock her up for a year or so, and then they let her out, but they say you can't go into Cookstown. Do you see what I mean? So she can't continue to have an independent existence and to get paid. She has to stay at home with her father until he dies in the end and she gets married. So again, she's not a famous figure, right? But the consequences for people, particularly in terms of migration and forced migration and confinement, are very considerable. And I think we have to think of them rather than simply focusing on the famous and on the dead of whatever. I'll stop it shortly. I have a lot more, Chair.
Another 10 minutes.
All right, oh good. I'll start again then. Again, we have to think in terms of how different Ireland might have been had partition worked differently. I don't know if you, this is a photograph from a fantastic collection, the O'Kane papers, which are in the in Armagh, the Cardinal from Sophie Library and Archive. But I don't know if you can see the names here or the people here. That man, you see the face? Jay Hoy, who's he? He's Johnny Hoy, yeah. That man is Dan McKenna. They were together in the South Derry IRA. Dan McKenna became, with all due respect to Sean Clancy, as he now is the current Chief of Staff, but McKenna was an absolutely outstanding officer, an outstanding Chief of Staff of the Army from 1940 to 1949. And he always spoke his mind, and a really interesting man. But the point is, Johnny Hoy came down and they both joined the Free State Army, even though they were particularly wanted Republican gunmen, if you like, in Northern Ireland. Like my grandfather, they had no choice but to leave. And so they end up on the pro-treaty side in the Civil War. All right? But at least, of course, Johnny Hoy, we know that amongst many things he gave Ireland, as well as his military service for many years, was his charismatic son, Charles J. And I'll say Dan McKenna became an outstanding military officer. So we in some ways you could argue that we gained from people having to leave the North. But we don't know how many, because we don't know, because of issues to do with the census and because nobody's really looked at these questions. And the same, not only in the public sphere, but in the private sphere, how many young women moved or had to move, right? Like Granny, because her husband had to move. Anyway, I think these are interesting questions that take us away, as what Ruth was saying earlier. We have to move away simply from focusing on the executions or on these so-called battles, right? And have to look at the conflict in Ireland in these years in terms of the impact on, if you like, ordinary people. Okay? I'm nearly finished here. Just to give you another example. Again, I'm sorry, but partly because of COVID, I haven't got back to Northern Ireland archives yet. So this is a file I looked at some years ago by a man called Dan Rice, a brother of my granny, Annie Rice, right, from Maherlone, County Down, all right? And that's his Northern Ireland interment file. And Dan was an IRA officer. He came south in 1922, as about 600 did, to be trained in the Corps to prepare for the outlandishly mad, quote, Northern offensive that the IRA jointly, the anti and pro-treaty forces were going to mount to sort of drive the specials into the sea and to unite Ireland. It was really a very problematic enterprise. And some people say it was really a devious trick to stop the most active Republicans in the North, for example, Seamus Woods, who was probably the most effective IRA assassin, if you like, in Belfast, who became a colonel in the Free State Army, to get this talent into the Free State side. Johnny Hoy, as well, as I mentioned, Dan McKenna are other examples. But Dan Rice goes back to the North in February 1923. He doesn't want to be part of the Civil War, and so on, as many Northern Republicans didn't. But what happens then, you probably can't read this, but this is from his file. They say, blah, blah, blah. It's February 23. He was active and dangerous member of the IRA and the principal organizer in the locality. And the question is, what do we do with him? Do we intern him? And the answer is yes. And he gets interned in quite a quiet place. There's a letter, postcards from him. Internees in the North could send postcards, right, out, but they couldn't send letters because they wanted the authorities censored the postcards, and they censored their incoming post, which is actually fantastic. The internees' files are great because they put in any political quotes in their files. But this is a letter from where is he in now? Yeah, he's in Lord Workhouse. He had been on their agenda and so on. And it's 3rd of December 1924. He's still locked up. He doesn't know when he's going to get out, although in fact he's amongst the last to get out in December 1924. And that's in Northern Ireland, where there wasn't a civil war, although there were loads of civilians killed, but somehow we're told that kind of conflict is different. So there was a particular hazard for Northern Republicans. If they stayed, this what might happen to them. Women as well as men. If they left, they got dragged into the conflict in this jurisdiction, and I think most of them in reality, if they were activists, certainly the men ended up on the Free State side. I'll just say down again, the happy news, he went to America, came back in the 1930s, and became, in fact when he died, he was the senior councillor in Down District Council. In 1965 in the Stormont election, he didn't win, but he ran against Brian Faulkner for the Stormont seat. So, the interesting thing there is that he moves from being a leading IRA man to being essentially what became the SDLP, right? And had more people like him, arguably, instead of becoming part of our separate jurisdiction and society and so on, had they been able, perhaps had they not been treated so harshly in the North, right? The North arguably might have become a better place and a more equal and fairer society, because a lot of the most active talent went between 1922 and 23, but especially in 22 because they had to. And I know there's an argument about the separate set of issues about the reduction in the Protestant population down here, including some who, especially in border counties, who went north. But you're seeing, I think there are things to be studied which haven't really been studied, which aren't military directly, but which are to do with how communities gain but also lose talent forever. And there is a kind of a hypothetical question of what might have happened had some of these people, some of whom turn out to be extremely active and competent, and to an extent even some women find room in the public sphere, usually in public services rather than in politics. But had they felt able to be up back where, after all, what their hearts were very often, up there as distinct from down here, it might have been a win for Stormont, if you like, or what became Stormont. Okay, well, I've kind of I haven't really started yet, as usual, Chief Justice. But I do think we need to look at violence in Ireland on an all-island basis. We need to look at the consequences of that violence on an all-island basis, precisely because people, some moved north or went to Britain, some moved south or went to Britain or to America once emigration became possible, right? I think we have so much wonderful material now. The death register, for example, is a small thing, but the death registers are now online and free. They used to be in the old General Register Office. It was a bit like, it was kind of late Victorian, but kind of public service management. You probably have never had to try to do research in these records, but it was just bizarre. It was a bit like Indian archives, which I've been in as well. Whereas now you can just search them online and get them online for nothing, right? And what I hope we can do with all this this material, particularly so much that is online, but also so much else that is it's in your attic. It's in your memory from what your grandfather said or from what your grandmother didn't say, that we can explore more creatively the impact of the conflict singular in Ireland between 22 and 24. And perhaps you'd come up with a much more nuanced understanding. And I'll just end, not for once with my family, I'll end with the memory of Winifred Hunt in Sligo. With 10 children, and now those children after 22 bore the taint of being the children of an alleged spy or informer. So how in God's name did people like her survive, and how did they do it, you know? And I think that in some ways is a bigger question than who set off the terrible bomb here, right? Or whether Sean Hales was just shot down the road, the pro-government TD and IRA Free State officer, whether they really intended to shoot him, or as they claimed to his brother at the time, the IRA, oh sure, it was a mistake, we were only trying to shoot the other fella, right? And if we look at the terrible moment in the 8th of December 1922, when Liam Mellows, Dick Barrett, Joe McKelvey and Rory O'Connor are taken out and shot without any law, except an explicit government decision. These are all important and dramatic moments, but think of the ordinary people, and think of, say, of Winifred Hunt as an example. Or think of poor Madge Livingston, at 13, just looking out the window and banged, and we still don't know, was she shot essentially because she was a girl, because she was Protestant, or just because, these things happen when you point guns at people. All right, thank you, Chair. All right, Chief Justice. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Eunan. Thank you very much, Ruth. I just thought Eunan might like to know that the phenomenon of Northerners having to move south didn't stop in 1924. And speaking as a Northerner who maybe didn't have to but did move south, one of the things that I really struck me about joining the Law Library was becoming a friend of a grand-nephew of Michael Collins and deviling with a grandson of Eamon de Valera. And I loved that and thought it was really, really interesting. It was part of what Eunan was talking about. And I'm also really intrigued by what he described. And I thought the Chief Executive of the Court Service is going will arrange for an inscription over this court that will say, Northern Ireland's loss, Free State's gain. I'd like to thank Eunan, I'd like to thank Ruth particularly for sharing with us that fascinating account of women in the Four Courts in 1922. And as I say, her blog is an absolute treasure trove of fascinating bits and pieces of information. And I'd particularly like to thank her for sharing that with us tonight. Our next event in the Four Courts 100 series will take place on the rather resonant occasion of the Friday the 24th of June. And we will be, on that occasion, we'll be launching the photographic exhibition in the Round Hall. We'll also hear from Michael Fewer, who's the author of The Battle of the Four Courts and the curator of the exhibition. We'll be joined by Kieran O'Connor, the state architect, and Katrina Crowe, formerly from the National Archives. There are a limited number of in-person tickets left, but going fast. And I hope I see you and back here and others on the 24th of June, 100 years to the day. But before that, perhaps you'll join us in a small reception outside. Thank you very much.